Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is not as healthy as she once was. We say that the current conditions in the world on-site government are in the perfect position to finally make a change to the Constitution that should have been done a long time ago. First on the model. So we see that this House is going to be the United States federal government. This is a U.S. federal government system. We don't think that this is any other way to do it. The background to this is currently the Supreme Court justice is supported by, or nominated and appointed by the President of the United States and then put through Congress. So largely the people are taken out of the system, and the President of the United States is essentially the largest power actor in who gets put into the justice system. We think that this is going to be objectively wrong, and we're going to show you on side government why we have a better system here and what the tangible impacts of this are going to be. This system of direct election, you're probably wondering, it's going to be by popular vote. So strictly popular vote, no electoral college, no nothing to that. The justices are going to be able to debate, they're going to be able to campaign, but there's not going to be any electoral college system. The weighing mechanism in this round is going to be which side better upholds the justice of the state and what would be the better justice system for us. So on to my first 2 points. The first is going to be population finally gets the democratic say. And number 2 is executive power is too strong. Let's take it down. So on to the first point, population finally gets a say. Currently, the constitutional system, it needs to change because the times have changed. And we say that governments are most acting in justice when they change according to the times and when they best provide for the people in the system in which they're living. This looks like widespread education that's currently happened within the United States in general. When the founding fathers of the United States made the Constitution, it was not only logistically improbable, but also educationally, I'll get you at the end of this point, but also educationally not rational to let every person vote because it just wouldn't happen at that time. That was 1775, now, or 1776. Rather now, we see that the best time now is in 2019 is not only do everyone have widespread education and people are more attuned with what's going on, but rather logistically this actually can happen because we see more people and more people getting involved in politics. The main link to this is that people we believe in the United States can determine what their governance should be, and we believe that the best governance is one in which the people are picking in democracy, they're democratically electing their leaders. So I'm going to get your point before I go into my text.
Yeah, so just as clarification, are there any qualifications at all required to run for Supreme Court Justice? Can I announce my term tomorrow?
So you'd have to have, it's the same qualifications that you need to currently be appointed by the president, as in you still need to go to law school, you need to have a good backing to go into the Supreme Court judge. It wouldn't just be anyone, these would all be lawyers that know the Constitution. So basically my impact on this population finally gets to say is that the United States is a democratic country, a democratic republic. And we believe that based on this House, not right now, based on this House, the best opportunity for democracy to improve justice, which is what we believe the United States people believe in, a democratic justice system, we want to shift the narrative and to give a goal of bringing power back to the people, because that's what democracy stands for, giving power to the people. And we think that when we give power to the people, they'll make better reforms and justice, they'll make better decisions, as we'll show you in the second half of the speech. But on to my second point, the executive power has become way too strong. We see that the executive office has grown to a power, since FDR and Trump, bureaucratic strength is at an all-time high. Increasingly, as time goes on, the President of the United States has pushed for executive powers. We now see in the Obama administration and the Trump administration more and more executive orders in which the President of the United States is completely disregarding both of the other branches of government in an effort to show basically their own policy agenda above the system. We say that this is not what the founding fathers originally intended for the system. They intended a system of checks and balances, a system in which, as Locke would say, balances each other out so that you have not one power that can become tyrannical. We think that the people of the United States are against tyrannical governments, and we think that the justice here would be that they would want to go against anything that becomes too tyrannical. The U.S. government fails because it will fail if it is not checked, because that is how the system is designed. If you completely switch the system to the way it was not designed, as it has been going since since FDR, we see a system in which it's not the rules aren't applying to the right branches because they were never intending the executive branch to be this powerful. We see that the executive power is basically going to increase to a point in which the president is the only person in the United States that's actually making policy action. Here's what this plan does on side government. It shifts what the president's power is going and gives that power back to the people. Okay, you
Yeah, so won't this just shift all of the power to the Supreme Court, which has fewer checks, rather than reducing the power of the presidency, just giving it all to another group?
So the Supreme Court's power has been maintained, I mean, early on, like in the 1800s, when they made high judicial court rulings, they had some increase in power, but we see that relatively throughout history, the executive branch has been the one that has really been expanding. The other branches, like legislative and judicial, have not been expanding at the rates that they are, and so this will even out the system and basically restore balance to the United States Constitution. So into these impacts that we're showing you here is that the executive power becomes a lower interaction with the people, and the president becomes unchecked. We're going to show you why, importantly, I'm going to talk about this right now, why it's most importantly now, but also just going on in the future. We see that President Donald Trump currently elected Brett Kavanaugh. I brought this up at the beginning of my speech, in which is somebody who's been completely discriminatory towards women, has had sexual assault allegations. But now we see Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, she's at a point in her health where she might not be with us, sadly, very longer. We say that this is a critical point in history where we should make these changes so that the people can make a system so that we're not completely destroying and putting in justices that aren't upholding the values of every American citizen. But further, because the executive branch has gotten to a point where it has exaggerated its power, this will only help future generations to stop tyrannical leaders such as populist leaders such as Trump from taking power in the future, taking power away. Because President Trump wants to keep power and maintain it so that he can put his agenda, especially when he sees the legislative branch as completely contradictory to his own agenda. We see the government shutdown happening right now. This gridlock shows that there is a strict misbalance going on, and the only way that it's going to increase or decrease is if we restore balance to the system. And the only way that we can do this is by giving the judicial nominations back to the people and take it away from the president. I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, so we got two main thrusts from the Prime Minister today, right? The statement that by and large we believe that direct democracy should apply in all cases, and we think that the more direct democracy is, the better it is for it, and the Supreme Court is following from this basic principle. What are these cases, right? And then the second thing that we think is that this is somehow going to limit executive power. I'm going to be dealing with the first one interwoven, but I'd specifically like to handle the second one. When they're talking about the ability to limit populist rhetoric or unqualified people from limiting presidencies, we see that there are wildly popular presidents that are elected directly by the people, right? That we think that the same people who are going to be voting for Donald Trump are going to be voting for justices that will not override Donald Trump, right? Consider that if FDR, for example, got the ability, while he was during the depths of the Depression, right, to elect any Supreme Court justice that we want, we don't think that this limits executive power, because we think that the problem with executive power is that the people don't check the executive power, right? You and me, the people out here, have not voted against presidents that have expanded the executive power. And there's no reason to think why we wouldn't vote for Supreme Court justices on this. But let's specifically, I'll get to it then in my first point, but I'd specifically like to do a brief talk about the importance of the Constitution, interpreting the Constitution, and why this can't be democratically elected. And then second, I'd like to actually posit what this future is going to look like tangibly and impact it out. So first off, let's talk about what the Constitution is. The first thing to note about the Constitution is that the Constitution is not a democratic document, really. It is fundamentally about limiting the ability of the majority to take away the rights of the minority. This is why they check states when they overstretch our rights. This is why they check democratically elected governments when they overstep our rights. If you want to change the Constitution, if you feel that there are issues with the Constitution, we advise you to do what is written in the Constitution, which is secure 3/4 of state legislatures or 2/3 of the Houses of Congress, right? That it is fundamentally a conservative document, and because of this, let's talk historically about how Supreme Court justices have acted. So the Supreme Court is an incredibly conservative political institution, right? I don't mean this conservatism in they support conservative causes. I mean, they're very slow to take change, and they are very measured about what they do. If you look, the institutions that we have set up in our Constitution to enact the will of the people is the legislature and the executive, and that's why they're regularly elected. The Supreme Court justice is elected for life, and they have certain unique obligations because of that. So, first off, let's talk about the qualifications. There are de facto qualifications that exist in the status quo because of the specific nature of the advice and the consent of the Senate, but there is no constitutional requirements that a Supreme Court justice has to follow the bar. It happens to be that the Senate, after reviewing lists of candidates and asking themselves, where do we want to see this country going 40 years down the line, picks from a small list of incredibly qualified constitutional scholars. The American people clearly don't care about this. We elected a man who wasn't elected dog catcher before, right? And while they're vetting these people, they specifically look down the past precedent of how we do, of what they've done this. They specifically try to find nearly middle-of-the-road, non-controversial judges, right? Recognize that the Kavanaugh nomination was mistaken outside of this. Our counter-proposal specifically is that we want to end the judicial filibuster and make it even more elitist, where 60% of the Senate is required to approve a Supreme Court justice. So by and large, we get people who are dedicated to this. Because of the lifetime nature of this appointment, right? By and large, these justices are concerned with their legacy, right? We see Supreme Court justices routinely acting against the people who went in this. Let's talk about Neil Gorsuch going against the ACA. Let's talk about Justice Black going against internment. Let's talk about Justice Kennedy was the deciding vote in keeping Roe v. Wade, right? That fundamentally, we see justices concerned with their legacies, we see them shift on the court, and we also see justices tend to wildly agree with one another, right? That Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Anthony Scalia voted the same way 77% of the time, because the main goal of the Supreme Court is to punish and fine clear violations of our essential liberties, right? And to do this on a much longer framework, rather than saying, we have issues at present. We fundamentally believe that in this round, you need to take the 100-yard view. And we believe that fundamentally we have to keep an empowered Supreme Court that is most concerned with protecting minority rights and not being at the whims of party politics, but opening disagrees.
The leader of opposition is trying to convince you that the American people aren't to be trusted. President Trump only won because of the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton won 2 million more votes than him in the popular election. This is the mechanism that we brought you today. Popular, not Electoral College.
Yeah, the scary thing isn't that Trump won because of the Electoral College. The scary thing is that Trump won 49% of the vote, right? We have to recognize that a more eloquent Trump, a Trump that was better able to follow up on the extremely populist sentiments that were running throughout this country at this time, were able to do this, right? And that it did not disqualify him, that he managed to destroy 17 more qualified Republican primary candidates, right? We think that we're going to see wildly unqualified people. So let's actually talk about what this world looks like when they do this. We think that candidates are going to be elected much like how politicians are elected on issues. We think that somebody says, instead of saying, I'm going to be a Supreme Court and uphold the Constitution, we think that you get what we see a little bit with Justice Amy Barrett, which is the reason why she wasn't picked. My name is Nathan Burns, and I will overturn Roe v. Wade, or I will overturn Citizens United. We think that by and large, citizens, when a Supreme Court doesn't go their way, are going to want to specifically see this overturned. We think that this is disastrous for the court. We think that by and large, you run into the same issues when you elect anybody. We think that we see an incredible connections to specifically corporate interests, right? Because we have to recognize these are still lifetime appointments. This is for all of the marbles. This is not only an election, but this is the single most important election that anybody can contribute to. So we fundamentally think that companies, if they think that they are going to come out poorly against justice, are going to be actively funding these people. We don't think that the American people and the popular consciousness is capable of looking at 40 years of case law and asking ourselves, is this the most qualified person to interpret the contract that we have all fundamentally agreed to in the United States? And there are differences in whether if you're an originalist or if you are a strict textualist, right? But we think that these differences are so much smaller than the relatively fickle nature of our politics in direct democracy, right? That we don't believe that the Constitution will be protected. We think that we are going to see, we believe that this fundamental, slow and elite group is a key element of protecting our democracy, and I have given you a reason to believe that the people that we have elected as Supreme Court justices will merely turn our Constitution into another cultural battleground. Proud to oppose.
do a couple of things in this speech. Let's look at the counter proposition we hear and interrogate that a little bit before we go into a few points of extraneous rebuttal before we get into the most important point we feel around, which is the actual effectiveness of the Supreme Court and how it can actually affect and start to alter, rather institute its social change. And so that being said, let's go to the counter proposition. We're told that we want this to be more elitist, in the sense we want it to be 60% of the legislature. A couple responses here. First of all, we feel like there's going to just expand upon existing party politics. We're told that we don't want on our side of the bench because party politics are going to be factored into. We're told that there's going to be party politics that may be factored into the judges. But we feel like we're keeping in the legislature itself that already keeps it within the existing mechanisms of government just to expand upon existing party politics, especially if we're looking for the majority, because Republicans or Democrats are going to be seeking just having a Republican or a Democrat on the justice or on the bench. But then second of all, we feel like these social elites here, or rather those in legislature, we feel are more out of touch with social movements, and that's going to be the team line that's going to be more focused on the government side of the bench, is that the people in the popular vote, which we advocate for, is going to be more in touch with social movements, are going to be more able to affect social change here. We feel like this elitist, keeping it within the legislature, one, it doesn't allow for better social change, but secondly, it has even less transparency in terms of selecting judges, because you're only going to have within the Senate, within the House, those kind of elections. You're only going to hear about it when scandals come up like Kavanaugh or when they're already appointed. We feel like having the popular vote is going to be better in this instance. But then we're also told further down, protecting minority rights. We'll kind of interweave that rebuttal with the social justice point. And then secondly, we're told that there's connections to corporate interests. First of all, this is not unique. We feel like there's corporate interests already talking President Trump's ear and talking within the cabinet. We feel like Rex Tillerson, and for example, Rex Tillerson, his connection to oil companies. We feel like there's already corporate interest already just running rampant within the executive branch. We don't feel that this is a unique argument. We challenge him to give a little bit more warranting as to why this could be weighed in today's round. But then we're also told in their response to our executive PowerPoint that wildly popular presidents are elected and people don't check the executive power. So Connor tried to tell you that President Trump only won by electoral college, and they come back and told you that it's a problem because only 49% of people still voted for Trump. But look to Republicans haven't had a winning popular vote since George Bush Sr. We feel like if you look to the popular vote, you're going to see more Democratic judges, and we're going to see a solving back against this stagnation they claim on the panel, or on the bench rather, because it's not going to be about trying to balance power. It's not going to be about trying to find middle of the line judges. It's going to be what the people are most fervent about, which is probably going to be social change, because I feel like this young educated generation is definitely more in tune with social change and social movements than those who are the old white guys sitting on the benches rather. So we feel like this solves the slow to change argument of feasibility, because looking at the merits of the change, looking at the merits of what these individuals are standing for, and being able to be more transparent about their ability to change, more transparent about where they're standing, these judges, that is going to be more beneficial to the bench entirely. But I'll take back that.
Do you believe that the Supreme Court was created essentially to be an apolitical institution?
I believe the Supreme Court was created to be a movement, a catalyst for social change. And that's what we've seen historically in Roe versus Wade, and in LGBTQ rights and gay marriage, and as well as especially Brown v. Board. We feel like this feasibility argument that we're getting out of opening opposition really doesn't stand to the point where they're ignoring, or they're not engaging with the fact that the popular vote is going to, we feel, tend to be more democratic. So let's get into the social justice point. We feel like the Supreme Court historically has been the best outlet for social movements. You always see, you see marches, you see social media protests, you see the catalyst for change, but really the final hammering blow is the Supreme Court that hammers in this social norm. And the examples I already told you, Roe v. Wade, gay marriage, and Brown v. Board of Education. We feel like currently we're tilted more conservative because of Judge Kavanaugh, but we can rebalance the Supreme Court and actually further more social change, because outside government we support the shifting of the shifting mindset of selecting, or rather the shifting almost purpose of the Supreme Court, which is that to be less impartial in the sense of having conservatives and liberals on the Supreme Court, but rather as a mechanism for change. We feel that the citizens then, as I've been saying, have been more in tune with social movements as opposed to the president. We feel like this can change the mindset of selecting judges to one of social progress, because having more transparency for those, for the popular vote, to understand the point, having more transparency for individuals to select these panelists, select those members on the bench, is going to allow them to better cater to the social interest of the majority of the people, which again we feel is more democratic. Before we get on the time frame argument, I'll take open.
Yeah, so we have the House of Representatives, which is elected every 2 years to specifically match our national interests, right? We think that this is about interpreting the Constitution, the guarantor of our rights, and we think that these are inalienable things that have to be examined in a much longer time frame.
Okay, so first of all, we feel like the House, fluctuates blue to red, and we feel like it becomes more political. So first of all, if you're trying to get out of party politics, just sticking within the House is, you already pointed out, you're just sticking within party politics. You're entrenching that within the social capability of that potential for social change that the Supreme Court has. We feel like this is why we need to separate that by having it expand outside of the government and legislatures to one, have transparency, but two, have the ability for social change. And so this is where we get onto the time frame argument, because while it is important to look to the long-term effect, I feel like it is also equally important to look towards the unique time now, because with Judge Kavanaugh tilting the scales to one that is probably going to be more opposed to social change, given just the conservative nature of it, or nature of the bench, as well as like we see in the future, Ruth Bader Ginsburg probably going to be leading the bench. We feel like it is most important now, especially in a more conservative political atmosphere, to have to shift the ability of selecting judges to fill that spot from a conservative atmosphere to one that is most likely going to lead to social change, and that is going to be through the popular vote. So open government here is telling you that it is most important to shift the perspective to the people for one, transparency, because you want to be able to have the individuals who are going to represent the popular vote, represent the better catalyst for social change, to have the ability to affect that social change. But then second of all, because it is going to allow for more social movements. It's going to allow for better treatment of minorities and women and the LGBTQ community, those who are disenfranchised, those who need social change. The Supreme Court now become that mechanism for social change, unprecedented through history. Thank you.
I'm going to begin by responding to the majority of points that MiBu brought up in his last speech, but I'd like to begin by recognizing the argument about reducing the power of the presidency, which was mostly dropped, but I would like to return to that because that is very much tied into a lot of my speech. In reducing the power of the presidency here, we will be effectively giving far too much power to another political organization, one which we do not wish to absolutely single-handedly decide the fate of our nation, now providing the mechanisms for how it will do so. But in the last speech, first off, we heard that it will promote transparency in the election. We don't think that the transparency will be in any way different from the status quo. Right now, we have lots of news agencies focused on the comings and goings of Congress. Every single change that during the Kavanaugh nomination was reported upon, and therefore the people had a very strong understanding of what happened there. And we do not believe that there was any significant degree of opaqueness in that situation. Then, also, their other point was primarily focused on a desire for the increased pace of change. And we agree that change is often good, but this is not the place to achieve it. As my partner presented to you, we already have two very realistic ways to change the Constitution, and a agency which is tasked with deciding and with interpreting the words of those other governing bodies is not the place to do it. They should be focused on that one position. So continuing with that is my first point, that it's not the job of the Supreme Court to legislate. Then that partisanship will be further solidified in the Supreme Court for the imminent future. Then I will be supporting and expanding upon corporate interests, finally closing with how disunity across the nation will be increased as a result of this and how that will be detrimental to the nation. So, why is it not the job of Supreme Court candidates to legislate? Basically, when we have institutions already designed to have a higher majority required than 50% required to change the Constitution, we should not be functionally lowering that majority to 50% in any one organization. That makes it far too easy to erase the core tenets of our democracy, and therefore increases the potential for change, but not only in a positive direction. There that simply leaving the Supreme Court nominations to a vote which, as they agreed, arbitrarily changes from year to year will lead to progressive policies. Simply because we know that often the Republicans, when their elections, it will often go that direction. And there is a possibility due to the life appointment that in the end we could get an all-red or all-blue Supreme Court just because of that possibility. Whereas my partner presented to you an opportunity to demand a higher threshold for choosing these people who will help decide the fate of our nation by interpreting the Constitution. By requiring the 60% vote in the Senate, we ensure that no one party is able to decide upon a candidate. And that will force us back to a time where we had normally unanimous votes before the nuclear option was implemented by Republicans and Democrats alike in appointing national judges.
Unanimous votes have been historically conservative. You're not going to seek the minority voice or have the minority voice heard by looking towards unanimous votes. You need to have the capability for the minority voice to be heard, which is through the popular Democratic vote with you.
Yeah, so that's fundamentally wrong, specifically because we have the Electoral College to amplify the minority vote in like states with smaller populations and stuff. Like that's literally the intention behind the Electoral College. Simply stating that minorities will be better represented is not correct because the minority is fundamentally not in the majority and therefore will not be represented better in a popular vote. There's no reason to believe that argument. Anyway, continuing on with my constructive material, on the fact that party lines will be further solidified in the Supreme Court. And basically what we see here is Supreme Court nominees will have to get aid in their elections because elections require a ridiculous amount of money, and this kind of ties into the corporate interests as well, because they will have to work with parties and with corporations if they want any hope of being elected. And when parties elect a Supreme Court nominee, they are going to elect someone who they have a guarantee of a lifetime commitment to that party. They are not going to waste resources on someone who they do not believe will basically be a rubber stamp for their party, because that's what we see Trump doing right now. He is selecting people because he can that will always support Republican conservative causes, and we can expect parties to operate no differently in the future, and that is not something we want, and the 60% threshold solves for that. Okay, on to the corporate interests. Billions of dollars are spent on a 4-year presidency. Supreme Court nominations are for life, which means it's far more profitable to invest here. And because, even as their case said, the Supreme Court is often the final say on any individual issue, because no one really checks back on the Supreme Court as effectively. The only check back was the presidential ability to nominate. They can effectively run the government in and of themselves, because there is no way to strike down a Supreme Court nomination in the Senate or by the presidency, which means once one party gains a majority, they will have absolute power. And when a corporation sees that, there is major incentive there, especially once we see the capacity to eliminate campaign contributions, assuming that the Supreme Court, now interested in getting money, is able to do so. So finally, on to the point about disunity. And we have seen disunity across the nation have significant harms. Increasing radicalization has had Americans at each other's throats and has prevented us from having any meaningful change in Congress, specifically seeing that the longest shutdown in government history is occurring as we speak. And that means that we need to have some institution which is exempt from this disunity, and also that it's not healthy for the nation in general. General populations of the Supreme Court will just have another place for the population to radicalize, whereas we saw almost every vote being entirely unanimous when that 60% threshold was still there. We will expect to see only generally supported Supreme Court nominees selected once we reinstate that, and therefore allowing us to have someone who is respected by all Americans and not someone as controversial as Brett Kavanaugh. For these reasons, I must urge the opposition.
I'm going to bring you today is a couple key things that I think have gone largely unaddressed in today's debate. The first is the impacts that this change will have on democracy and why I think that this is actually better for democracy and better for a larger democratic system that protects citizens over the government. And then the second is going to be why I think that this is actually largely going to be fundamentally great for progressive movements around the country. So, but first I want to get into like a couple points of extraneous rebuttal on the opening opposition side. So the first thing that they come up here and say in their last speech is that the Supreme Court can't legislate. Well, that's great because they literally can't legislate. Like, there's no way for the Supreme Court to mandate Congress to pass any sort of law. So they literally can't pass any sort of law. All the Supreme Court can do is stop laws that are largely regressive from that are largely regressive or progressive from being passed. So they can only stop laws that they disagree with. They can't actually create new legislation. They can't enforce social change. So there's no way for them to mandate Congress to pass laws, and there's no way that this harm of the Supreme Court legislating too much is actually going to come to fruition that the opposition is saying. And then they say, they talk a little bit about party interests and corporate interests. I don't think that's particularly unique. I think that permeates our entire system of democracy. The reason that party interests and corporate interests are so important right now is because our system of democracy isn't direct. Our system of democracy relies on the minority, people in rural states getting to have a little more social say than people in big cities. And then they bring up this point that I think is really interesting about how this is going to contribute to disunity in America. And I think they talk a little bit about why radicalization is bad and how the longest shutdown in history. They tout out the longest shutdown in history as their main example of why disunity is so bad. But the longest shutdown in history wasn't caused by average American voters democratically deciding things. It was caused by things like the Supreme Court. Well, it was caused by things like gerrymandering, things like districts, and things like the Electoral College. And opening government in their model specifically said that this would be a direct vote. So we think that this shutdown and this politicization actually comes from the interests of it comes from the way that our political system is organized rather than just the fact that people disagree with each other. It comes from the idea that Congress can't shut down the government if they can't agree for long enough. Supreme Court wouldn't have any similar power to just stop anything from ever happening. So then let's get into my two major points of constitutive new matter. The first is going to be why this the Supreme Court as a check on the people should rely on the people voting them in. So basically this fundamentally relies on the social contract theory that the people should have some way to check their government. The Supreme Court is basically the primary check for governmental power. Because the Supreme Court can't actually pass legislation, all they can do is check legislation that isn't good. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that people are the people of the United States are the primary stakeholders. I'll take back half after this point. The people are the primary stakeholders in checking governmental power, not government. In the status quo, the government controls its own primary check on people. Go ahead.
Okay, so the Supreme Court is made to be uniquely different from the other two branches. By making them appointment process the same as the legislature, don't you just make another more exclusive legislature?
Well, not really, because legislature is riddled with the same issues as the voting system for the president, with districts and gerrymandering. A popular vote, and I'll show this later, is always going to trend progressive, and I think that has fundamental impacts on the way we treat minorities and different bodies in our community. So essentially, what the problem that I see on the fundamental the fundamental level is that in the status quo, the government, the president, controls the primary check on his power. He has complete control over almost complete control over who gets appointed to check his own power. So I say we give that check back to the people, allow the people to check governmental power instead of the government itself. Go ahead.
Yeah, so what happens if these people elect an unqualified Supreme Court justice and they're on for life? With our elected representatives, we can vote them out at the end of their terms. These are life terms. These are incredibly important decisions, and they should not be made lightly by the American people voting for majoritarian candidates.
So I think the direct democracy component is going largely unignored by the opposition bench because direct democracy prevents that very harm, and I'll show you why right now. Why is direct democracy good? Why is this going to lead to more progressive Supreme Court nominations? Well, we can see in recent history and across the history of America, history trends progressive. We can see this with the blue wave in the past midterm cycle. The blue wave shows that progressive ideas are gaining traction. They're more popular than they ever have been before. before. And even when the alt-right was at its strongest in 2016, the Dems won the majority of votes. Even when the conservative ideals of someone like President Trump are the strongest they've ever been, the progressives are still coming out to vote more. They're still voting more than conservatives. And I think, so basically what we're saying is that the nomination process as it currently stands reinforces a harmful status quo where minority communities actually don't have enough say over who gets to decide who gets to be in the Supreme Court. The status quo and government or opposition is telling you that this protects minorities, but it doesn't really, because it protects one minority, rural, uneducated, white voters, and that's not really a minority. Like, that's the only people who are protected by the way the Constitution is currently set up. So we think that the nomination system as it currently stands reinforces the status quo in two ways. One, the presidents have power over the Supreme Court for 4 to 8 years instead of individual nominations coming up and people deciding on those individually. And then the second is that presidential elections have always favored rural communities with a minority of votes, and these rural communities overwhelmingly have regressive ideals. And these regressive ideals have, and I think it's important to stress this, have real harms on like black and brown bodies and LGBT bodies and on women. And I think that enforcing this system that promotes these regressive ideals is always going to maintain like a power dynamic between white middle-class men and lower-class minorities and LGBT people. So essentially, we think that this change will allow Democrats to concentrate their political power on like informing people and getting them out to vote for Supreme Court justices that will implement checks on government when they try to make legislation that's bad for people. So we can see like Roe versus Wade was an example of a great Supreme Court decision. It protected women, protected their autonomy, and we want to see more decisions like this overturning legislative decisions that are focused on hurting minorities or focused on keeping immigrants out of this country. We think that the Supreme Court should have the fundamental check for that power rather than the president. Thank you.
Why maybe is the Supreme Court set up this way? Well, the Supreme Court was set up this way specifically because it is a check and balance on the other branches. Moreover, I think it's important to note that the Supreme Court is not a popularity contest, and moreover, many of the good things the Supreme Court has done over time would not exist if it were a popularity contest, such as, I don't know, like civil rights, which were incredibly unpopular with like 80% of the American public at the time that Supreme Court justices did not align with those beliefs and created changes. Like, sure, you do see some regressive policies, but you also do see some progressive ones over time. The Supreme Court was created to be an apolitical institution. And I believe that making it a more political institution for direct democracy directly compromises that goal in every way, shape, and form. Simply arguing for an alternative of like, oh, well, like, I think that there's like 2 essential premises that are very wrong coming from this half the bench. First off, elections are good. No, elections suck. That's going to be my first substantial point. Second off, popularity, like this idea, I think that there is also this idea of like, oh, well, change is fundamentally good. We're going to be like fundamentally like changing society. I just think that that's wrong. Just because you change society doesn't mean you are changing it in a positive way. And saying that history trends progressive is inherently harmful when 30% of the world currently lives in what is called a backsliding democracy, or a democracy that has elected a problematic official through direct things, such as, Brexit happened because it was direct popularity. Jair Bolsonaro, who is on the far right of Trump, happened because of direct democracy. And also, Putin has incredibly high popularity all throughout Russia. This whole idea that just because everybody wants it, it's inherently correct, I think is inherently wrong. When you look furthermore at the people who are harmed by it. So going over those points, for this idea too that elections are good is fundamentally made on this idea of enfranchisement. So I'm going to directly combat this with my own substantial point. Elections kind of suck. This isn't me saying that all elections are inherently bad. Instead, I would argue, first off, voter turnout, and second off, elections are unsafe. First off, voter turnout. Approximately 50% of the American public turns up to vote. In fact, during even this last midterm cycle, you saw about 52% of the American public, and that was record-breaking. It was the first time in over 20 years that we had seen that many people. Suddenly leaving up 50% of people to suddenly make this decision is not necessarily good. Furthermore, it also needs to be noted that marginalized communities disproportionately do not vote because they do not have the ability to do so. Just because over time, inherently you see the fact that there is a 10 to 20% decline in people who vote when they exception of people who like don't have like many of these abilities, like for instance voter ID laws. Voter ID laws directly harm disenfranchised communities, and furthermore also have disproportionately harmed in the past throughout history, African American communities and other underrepresented groups. This is uniquely bad when oftentimes it is the issues of these minorities and these people who are oppressed that end up before the Supreme Court. You are disproportionately not giving those people a voice when you say, well, let's just have like everybody vote and let's just have that work out. Because inherently a popular vote does not proportionally represent those who are already minorities, which inherently like provides like, I think this whole idea of this grandstanding by the bench where it's like, oh, people are just inherently good, but also too people will just inherently be able to like represent these minorities, I think it's just like inherently a bad premise that fails to look at the major issues that happen with voter turnout. Sure, I'll take you all the next question.
All right, so first of all, closing opposition is clearly saying something that's completely false. What we see is that the Democratic elections, or like the Democratic presidential candidate has won since 2000 via popular vote. Those are the people that support things that help minorities in the system today.
Okay, so just because like Hillary Clinton would have won by a popular vote doesn't mean that worldwide like you don't see those changes. Like all of that work that I did showing you that Putin is incredibly popular in Russia, Bolsonaro is incredibly popular in Brazil, Brexit passed in Britain, and all of these things where popular votes are like incredibly harmful and still standing. Like this is an incredible like US-centric view that I just think is wrong. And I still think some of these issues like do apply to our US election system. Second off, elections are unsafe. I don't know, nobody has talked about how elections can be uniquely unsafe. Like for instance, like 10,000 people voted for Harambe. But much more than that, you also see the fact that in 2016, we saw an incredible amount of Russia collusion that helped turn a lot of votes towards Trump. You also see collusion and like other issues. We have like no absolute like standard that shows that that our elections are incredibly safe. Like for instance, did you know that in 2002, DIPTA, I believe it's called, that supplied voting machines, actually just rebranded and is over and still provides election machines when like these election machines uniquely did not work during Bush's election, and it's oftentimes like attributed to massive amounts of voter fraud. So actually, DIPTA is still in charge of 64% of the world's voting machines. They have simply rebranded under a new name. You see issues like DIPTA. You also see the fact that in 2018, during the midterms, the Attorney General of a state ran directly against a candidate who was, the Attorney General is over the election process. Like you inherently see the fact that like you don't solve any of these issues with elections simply by saying like, let's have direct election. And instead, you incentivize like this whole popularity thing where suddenly you have this increasing marketability of candidates. So I'm gonna go over one of the things, I'm going to talk about this corporate interest point, but I'm going to flesh it out so much more. So first off, I think that you inherently, like, we don't get into the meat of the issue when we talk about this. Popularity is based on a corporate interest, and issues like name ID really matter. Second off, by making this a popular vote, you also incentivize through campaigning many corporate interests, such as, I don't know, the NRA and super PACs. You suddenly give the ability of private institutions to heavily market these candidates so that these candidates can gain more popular support. Furthermore, you also incentivize these people going on things like television shows to announce candidacy and continually doing interviews. So much of campaigning is based on corporate interests and also on how you can affect like the average person, as opposed to checking that system uniquely and providing like a voice, even though it may be unpopular. Furthermore, fraud is specifically incentivized by a lifetime appointment. Additionally, I think you see many of like the good. I think that moving to a system without any checks, when at least now we have a president and a senate, but just saying let's only have popular people and no check on that is really dumb. And finally, I also think that any model, whether it be having an impartial jury pick a Supreme Court or having a filibuster, or like there are so many other good models and good alternatives that help to depoliticize the process, where inherently on like the gov side, you just see that you politicize this process more and more, and you inherently turn these Supreme Court justices into just like elected officials. And you also make them susceptible to that same type of corporate greed, that same type of election fraud, and the same issues that we see now. And you compromise their ability to do anything right. Thanks.
We outside government believe it's time to stop the lack of absolute power that people have in their own lives. I've got 4 points for you today, Mr. Speaker. The importance of the life term, the power of the president, the power to the people, and checks and balances. Beginning first with the importance of the life term. And the yellow comes up here and he brings up the idea that there are going to be some candidates that are unqualified. And we say that but it's a popular vote. Donald J. Trump, and this has been brought up, lost by 3 million votes and has only lost popularity since his election. What having this popular vote allows is it means that Donald Trump, an unpopular president who was not elected by the majority, can no longer railroad through unpopular nominees, give them stolen seats, give men accused of sexual assault power over the American people. The yellow comes up here and acts like it's a legitimate idea that we should risk the success of progressive movements to keep the president already too powerful. We outside government say that is not acceptable. He also brings up the idea that judges flip or vote in the status quo, and we say that the yellow does not understand the importance of a life term. It means that they are not beholden to party politics. They are defined by their legacy, not their support to their party. They show that example through their case. And this gives the Supreme Court power back to the people. Because right now, the Supreme Court is an extremely elitist body. Every single current member of the Supreme Court has either a law degree from Harvard or Yale. I don't understand how they can relate to the people, the average people. Moving on to the idea of the power of the president. So the DLO talks about how people knew about Brett Kavanaugh. They had no power to stop him, is what we say is upsetting. A man who has been accused of sexual assault does not belong on the most powerful bench in the country, possibly the world. And we say and he also brings up the idea that he also fails in his speech to explain how their solution stops party lines from happening. There are still these extremely right-wing judges, there are these left-wing judges that exist in the status quo. If they think that's going to change under our model, they're wrong, because there's still hard R's and hard D's on the Supreme Court. Moving on to the idea that the DLO brought up about no checks and balances, there's still no checks and balances within the current system. The Supreme Court can still vote however they want to, and the American people have no power over it. That's why it's incredibly concerning when Donald Trump is looking specifically for Roe v. Wade judges who are there to take away rights from the American people, supported rights that trim progressive that people want. And to the final point the DL brought up about disunity, we have disunity because of a lack of say by the people. The president can choose a man accused of sexual assault and confirm him, and that frustrates people because they have no say. There's nothing they can do to prevent this. Moving on to the idea of power to the people. And we outside government, no thank you, say that this is ultimately going to be better for democracy. We say that SCOTUS is primary power, and we say that they can check and balance bad legislation, but there's also the idea that they can check and balance the powers of the president. We say that this is an incredibly bad system because the president gets to pick who checks his powers and balances. Let's say I got to choose the judges in today's debate. I'm going to choose my parents, obviously, because they're going to vote me up. The president's going to choose people who vote him up, that support him. We say that this is incredibly, there's no way you can access the idea that the president has the Supreme Court checks and balances the president when he gets to choose the members of that body. Moving on to the idea that and this also moves into the idea that minorities can get a shot to vote for more people that help them. Something that went completely unaddressed on side opposition today was the idea that this can prove for candidates that are more supportive, because there would be a primary process. As Ryson pointed out, there would be more discussion for candidates to the Supreme Court. People would have the ability to choose a candidate they think represents them the best. That is completely lost when almost every single member of the Supreme Court throughout its history has been a white man. We say that this at least gives a shot that there will be representation. They have no solvency for that on side opposition. And moving on to my final point about checks and balances. But first back half.
How do you respond to my point that direct democracies.
Yeah, so they don't get a vote for the Supreme Court in the status quo. At least here, they get to vote, and that's I guess this is going to go right into your point about how elections are unsafe. I'm going to go a little out of order. So what's the plan for unsafe elections? If you're concerned about the election safety, is the solution to just stop having elections? Do we completely backslide into no democracy? Is that what the plan is? And the idea that the final point you brought up under elections are unsafe about marketing and how there would be marketing for Supreme Court justices, there'd be commercials for that. First of all, that happens in the status quo. I'm from Colorado. When we did the Brett Kavanaugh and the Neil Gorsuch, when they were having those votes, I can't even tell you how many ad campaigns I saw that were make Michael Bennett vote for Brett Kavanaugh, make Michael Bennett vote for Neil Gorsuch. This marketing still exists, and it's not it's never going away. We live in a capitalist society. I can't tell you what to do about marketing. Moving on to the idea about checks and balances. So the member talks about how it's not a popularity contest. I would say that's wrong. It's just a much smaller popularity contest with 100 senators who get to choose who goes on the Supreme Court. It's kind of a blind statement to say that it's not a popularity contest when 0.00001% of the people get to choose the popularity contest versus the American voting population. That's obviously the much better solution, where the American people get to choose who's protecting their rights and checking on the president. So what we've shown you in today's debate is that the current system has no true checks and balances. Our current system, or the proposed system, will provide more power to the people, and so for those reasons, I am so proud to propose. Thank you.
Rampant with issues every single day, why does having a solid branch matter? Well, to answer that, I have two questions for you. One, what does this look like in the process of favoring, going back to the heart of the motion? And I guess in this round it's direct democracy. And then the second question is going to be, why is switching the presidential nomination with direct election an equal exchange? Or why favor direct democracy in this case? But first I'm going to go over refutation, answer crystallizing questions, and then go on to some impact calc for this round and some voters. Make your life just so much easier, panel. Okay, in the last speech, we just heard this wrong side. Oh, yeah. In the last speech, we heard three big points. One, this is a risk of progressive movements losing their platform. But this isn't true, and this is just fundamentally flawed. In the world of the opposition, we are allowing for these movements to have these ample power, to allow for these grassroots movements, and for these organizations to continue with their movements. Thus, by having it separate from a political jurisdiction in which we don't politicize or make it just based on parties, we allow for these progressive movements to continue to move. It's not like backlogging and any of that. But what we also start to see is that, this isn't about giving the people the power. It isn't about allowing for more accessibility to voting, because nothing in the world of the government explains the world in which more people are able to access voting or more access to information about voting. So this issue is just fundamentally flawed. Why is that? Because A, people can't get to voting machines. B, voting machines are problematic because one, they don't work, and two, not everyone has access to them, and tapes work off for 5 hours to be able to wait in a line and vote. I'll take your question in a second. Then, the next and biggest argument we hear in this is that minorities don't get a voice in this, and that minorities are being represented in the Supreme Court justice. But this isn't right, because one, Supreme Court justices being elected by the population and the popular vote wouldn't really matter, because they wouldn't be able to have that vote and the accessibility to know about people who are in this, or to know about having the accessibility to vote. Back half.
So how is your point about voter accessibility and voting machines unique to the Supreme Court when it also operates across all elections for Senate and the President, who ultimately then nominates Supreme Court justices?
Yeah, what we already say is, in the status quo, we're already implementing more people being able to vote in this progressive waves, which we're seeing right now. But we can't say that like good is good enough, right? And so if we amplify for the Supreme Court justice to be formed in this realm of where voting is inaccessible, then we're not equaling the issue here. So let's get back to the two crystallizing questions. One, what does this process look like? Favoring, right? So in this world, I guess the government's saying it's direct democracy. And why is this bad? Because one, the time frame is bad. It's a form of distraction in which we allow more people to implement their views and distract from what's actually going on, i.e. things like the border, the government shutdown and things like that. We need to be focusing our attention on issues going on in this time. So we can't see that having consistent or constant elections of Supreme Court justices is the best way to go about this. Also, the Senate check gone. This is going to be one of the biggest reasons as to why you want to vote in the opposition today. Opposition has done a really good job of trying to lay out and form for you the way in which we don't have the same, the Supreme Court justice has its own job following its own legislation. Cool. But then Katie comes up and tells you literally the biggest missing link within the round is that when we have direct popular vote, then we start to lose the Senate check back. Why does that matter? Because then you get to implement rules for anyone to become Supreme Court justice. We lose sight of who and what becomes Supreme Court justice. They're standing and telling you, yeah, only people from Harvard and Yale are becoming Supreme Court justices. And although that's pretty cool, that's a really good school, good for them. That's probably not good because that means they got that education. That means they got that. They went and got that sort of knowledge. Yeah. And so having the Senate check back gone is net worse because it allows for anyone to become Supreme Court justice that goes to Harvard, and it also allows for less check within governments. Yeah. Second question: why is switching the president nomination with the direct democracy good? Because it's not. No, it's a popular contest. It leads to more harmful damages. It leads to changing bad lacking, and it leads to voter turnout, which we can see literally anytime we have voter issues. So we need to not be talking about this. We need to not be talking about these issues of process of. We need to be talking about the process of favoring rather than the harms and implications of it. So voter turnout is a big reason as to why you're going to be voting in the opposition. Yeah, the House is changing now, but just like trends are always changing. Like hoops were in, but now they're not, but now they're back. These kind of questions are really big, right? So we need to start talking about why the Supreme Court needs to not be consistently changing and needs to follow the political times. Sure.
So I really don't think you're engaging with the fact that even if minorities don't turn out, you still see largely Democratic voters who are more representative of the interests of minorities or those that are going to influence social change.
Okay, and so alright, so Democratic candidates are going into House, and when we're seeing right now in the Senate, are becoming more into Congress, then we can start to see that check back, which is crucial in politics, and is even more crucial in the Senate check back for Supreme Court justices, is becoming more blue. Then we have more check back that's blue and Democratic for whoever's running for Supreme Court justices. So we can see that the presidential nomination is the only way to uniquely solve for this. Yeah, that was a weird question. Okay, voters. Let's get to voters as to the world of the government and the world of the opposition. The world of the government is giving you a world in which we have direct democracy and popular vote for the people. But it's not for the people, because who has access to these voting machines? Who are the people that's going to be accessing the ability to vote? They never answer voter turnout. They never continuously answer it in a way in which more people have garnered accessibility to it. It leads it to a world in which we don't have checks, in which we